My name is Christine Rhodes, and I came to live here in Camp Naco at the age of 8 years in August of 1957. Well, I ended up here because my father was from this area. He was born on the other side of the Huachuca Mountains, and many people don't know this, but part of Cochise County extends over to the western side of the Huachuca Mountains. My father joined the Customs Service as a very young man and was fortunately able to be assigned to work in the Naco Port of Entry as a young man. Of course, in those days, people were transferred, as they are now, to different ports of entry. So he served Naco, Nogales, San Luis, Lukeville. But when I came over here, he was transferred from the port of entry at Lukeville, where people cross over to go to Rocky Point. But he was able to move to Naco. We moved in, and I attended school at the Naco Elementary School, or Naco School as we call it, and I remained in Naco School till, of course, I graduated from the 8th grade here. So my younger years from age 8, we moved here when I was 8 years old, and until I went to Bisbee High School. But we had a lot of exciting times here in Camp Naco. It's the first place that we had a telephone in the house. We had our first black and white television with a tall antenna outside the house. And I would turn that antenna so we could get a channel. And I would be shouting into the house to say, "Is it getting clearer now?" Because we wanted to be able to watch channels 4, 9, or 13, but we could really only get one at a time. So that was something that, I was the one in charge of turning the antenna. We had a beautiful house here in Camp Naco, the first house located off of Wilson Road. And I would like to tell you about a friendship that I had with Mrs. Newell, who was the landlady. And we rented here for $40 a month. And it was just a beautiful place to live and to ride my bicycle, because I love to ride the bicycle here on Newell Street. I had a 26-inch J.C. Higgins 3-speed bicycle. It was way too big for me. But in my family, that's it. You had one bicycle for life. You had to grow into it. We just really loved living in Camp Naco. But with that $40 a month rent, that was a little steep. So after about 2.5 years, we moved over to Rodriguez Street in Naco, to a smaller house, but with lower rent. My earliest memories include moving into the second house off of Wilson Road with my family, and this is where we received modern conveniences. We had an indoor washing machine. It's the first one we ever had. We could exchange our gasoline-powered, our butane refrigerator for our very first electric refrigerator. We had never had a telephone either. So we had our first home telephone installed, party line, of course. So I know in those days, if you had a party line telephone, you could listen to your neighbors talking. The next door neighbors were working at Fort Huachuca, because in the 1950s, when Fort Huachuca opened again, there was not adequate housing for people who worked at Fort Huachuca. So many people lived in Naco and Bisbee. I went to a school here at Naco School. I graduated in a class of 18, trying to be valedictorian, but it ended up I was number 3. So the disappointment has never left me. And then I went to Bisbee High School, again, trying to be an excellent history student or a student in general. And I graduated from Bisbee High School, then I graduated from Cochise College, and I went to Northern Arizona University and specialized in history of the American Southwest, of course. That was my main interest. Of course, going back to when I was a child here, I wrote stories about Camp Naco. I didn't know about the Buffalo Soldiers. I didn't know anything about the 9th and 10th Cavalry or the 25th Infantry. I didn't think about those stories, but I wrote stories about what I call the Buffalo Hills, the hills at the base of San Jose. I had a job teaching for Cochise College, but I heard about, oh, the county recorder is retiring. So I was recommended by the sheriff of Cochise County, Jimmy Wilson, who lived in one of the Camp Naco buildings, which is not on the Camp Naco campus. It's the one where David Lloyd lives. And so I was elected county recorder and served 44 years. It was a great experience. Now, I didn't really relate too much about my family. My grandfather was stationed at Fort Huachuca in 1899, and he followed, actually he was stationed in the areas where the Buffalo Soldiers were. He was stationed, he joined the military in 1888 in San Antonio, Texas. He followed the Buffalo Soldiers to South Dakota and was stationed there for a few years. He was a member of the 8th Cavalry and served alongside of the Buffalo Soldiers in South Dakota. And then he came to Fort Huachuca after being stationed in other Army installations. He came to Fort Huachuca for a short time. Then he was transferred to where the Philippine insurrection was occurring. And that insurrection was related to the Spanish-American War, of course. He went to the Philippines for 9 years, more than 9 years. Now, he had 7 enlistments in the military, but he was always serving side by side with the Buffalo Soldiers that were not, of course, called Buffalo Soldiers out here in the West. We didn't use that term. He would use, and am I allowed to say he was serving with the colored soldiers. And in the Philippines, he was serving with the Philippine Scouts. And he was married over there, and several of his children were born in the Philippines. So that brings a story to me personally, because my father was actually born over here when my grandfather left the military in 1913 after serving for 30 years. So he was given credit for 30 years. But my father and some of the 12 children were born over here in this area, in Patagonia, out on the ranch, in Washington Camp, in various areas near the ranch. So I was here because my grandfather moved to the San Rafael Valley. Now I could tell you a little bit about Mrs. Newell. She was the kindest person, and she taught me a lot of things. I was a small girl, 8 years old when I came here, but she used to hire me because she was a traveler. She would go to Mexico City, she would travel on big trips. So she would hire me to take care of her dogs when she was on her trips. she had a son named Jack, and he lived here too. Now, Mr. Newell was living at that time, but I have to say I really never communicated with him. I worked with Jenny Newell, who was a young lady probably at that time, who came from the town of Pomerene, a little bit to the north. And so she taught me a lot of things, and she had her beautiful kitchen. She had a cook, and she had an ironing board that came out of the wall, which was fascinating to me. But this is one of the places where I learned a lot about responsibility, learned a lot about Newell's Camp. I didn't know much about the military living here. I learned that later when I was probably in college. I attended college and I went to NAU and specialized in history of the American Southwest, which was extremely appropriate. So I received a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in history. And I love Camp Naco, and I was just astounded that this beautiful area was being allowed just to melt away with the weather. But we had a great savior.
Yes. Yes.
After Vision Quest was not allowed to develop the area, we had a great savior. And her name was Becky Orozco. And she saw the potential. She saw it, and she saved Camp Naco. And I was slightly involved with the Naco Heritage Alliance in those days when it was first being developed. And I was not involved for a few years. And then I was so happy when I heard Camp Naco will be developed into something great and spectacular for the future history of Arizona, the future history of the American Southwest. I was so proud to know that I had a part in this as a little child. I was very little when I came here. I was a very small child, and I learned about the history of Naco as it was told in those days. We knew it was a military camp, but we never knew that it was related to the Buffalo Soldiers. And today I'm proud to say I'm a life member of the Southwest Association of Buffalo Soldiers. So I'm becoming very acquainted with that.
Camp Naco to be.
I see a vibrant community at Camp Naco. I see young people studying and learning here. I see people living in some of the houses, perhaps, having offices here. I see musical presentations, because Bisbee and Naco are music communities. And I just see a great future. And not just for visiting students, but for students from Naco Elementary School. And proudly I can say that I've raised my family here and I have children. My children are grandparents, raising families here. And my daughter has been a teacher at Naco School for 18 years. So she's seen a couple of generations of Naco children. Not just Naco, Arizona children, but probably primarily Naco Sonora, which is a great interest to us also.